Hello, class. Welcome to week 2 of BMN 507 Bible Overview for the summer quarter 2022 at International University of the East. I hope you've all had a good week, and hopefully you are enjoying the class so far. Week 1, I know we covered a lot of material, and that was probably pretty difficult. Week 2's also going to be maybe a little difficult. We got also some introductory material to cover, but we will start actually getting into the Bible story, and which will continue throughout most of the rest of the quarter. So I think, in my opinion, that's going to be quite a bit easier and quite a bit more interesting when we actually get into talking about the story or the parts of the Bible itself, instead of all the introductory material. We have to cover it first. So I think that will be better once we get going, and we'll get into that this week. Now, before we proceed, I want to cover some suggestions for the research papers. So let me open that file. Okay, so now please note, this is not your homework assignment for week 2. These are my suggestions for topics for the term paper that is due week 10. And you'll choose one of these following topics, and only one, to research and write about. And you can also choose something different. So it's not required that you choose one of these. If you have something else in mind you want to write about that relates to the Bible, you can pick that instead. But these are just some suggestions to help you if you're having trouble deciding on a topic. The paper should be about 5 to 7 pages long. So I've set 1 page for the title page, 3 to 5 pages for the body, and 1 page for the bibliography. Now, at my other school, we require using 6 sources, and we're using or following the Turabian style for citations. That's not a hard and fast rule for your school. I don't know if your school has requirements for the number of sources and the citation style. Some schools might use Chicago or APA or MLA, so any of those is fine. But I would say probably at least 3 sources would be the minimum. 6 would be a good number. You don't really need more than that. And if you don't follow a style, then I recommend the Turabian style, just because that's what I'm most familiar with, and to my knowledge is what it's most commonly used for theology and humanities subjects. And maybe I'll give you some samples of that in a future week. So this paper is due by the end of the quarter on week 10. And this counts as, if this is one of the course requirements, it counts 20% of the grade. This does not replace the attendance assignment for this week or any other week. So please don't give me this assignment, and especially don't answer or write about all 12 and give that to me next week and think that that is your homework for the week. This is, you do still have your normal homework for this week, and this is just, I'm slowly covering, preparing you for how to write this paper. So this is just my suggestions for topics. I've given you 12. Again, you'll pick just one of these or something else that you want to do. So number 1, compare and contrast Moses and David as national and religious leaders of Israel. How are they alike in their responses to those who oppose them? How are they different? Number 2, compare and contrast Abraham and his grandson Jacob as patriarchs or fathers of the Hebrew people. In what sense do their experiences foreshadow the struggles of the Israelites? Number 3, compare and contrast the views of creation versus evolution. Number 4, describe in detail the 10 Commandments. How did these influence later laws? So these laws were originally for Israel, but they've also been influential historically for the laws of nations such as the United States or other nations. You might want to pick a different nation to write about, or you can think about how they influenced the legal system of the United States. Number 5, compare God's choosing of Israel as his particular people with his concern for all nations. How are these two ideas related, or how do they conflict? Number 6, describe the important women in the New Testament, or write a character study of one of them. Number 7, describe the similarities and differences among the 4 Gospels. Number 8, is the Christ of Christian faith the same as the historical Jesus? Number 9, write a character study of Paul. Number 10, describe the cultural struggles in early Christianity as the Gentiles embraced the Christian gospel. Number 11, choose one book or passage of the Bible and write a detailed analysis of it. And number 12, what is the relationship between the Old and New Testaments? How do they fit together? Okay, so those are, again, are just some suggestions, and that paper is due week 10. So please don't give me a paragraph of each of those next week and think that's your assignment for the week. That is not what I'm looking for. I want you to choose just one topic and write a 5 to 7 page paper, submit it by the end of the term, and keep doing your normal weekly attendance assignment each week. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. And now we will turn to the lesson for the week. With Chapter 2, Preparing for the Journey. An orientation to the methods of biblical study. So in Chapter 1, you received an orientation to the literary, historical, and contemporary worlds of the Bible. In this chapter, you will encounter an overview of the various methods developed by scholars of the Bible to illumine or to help with the literary, historical, and contemporary worlds. First, we will examine the type of study appropriate to a journey into the literary world, the world within the text. The goal of this approach is to understand the meaning of the literature itself. Therefore, we call this type of study intrinsic. Study of the historical world of the Bible draws on evidence outside the Bible to reconstruct the history of which the biblical text is a part. It also utilizes the evidence found in the Bible to develop and test historical theories. We call this type of study extrinsic because it relates to the world outside the text. A principal value of extrinsic study is that it helps us understand what the Bible meant when it was written by exploring how it was written, for whom it was written, and what situations motivated the writing. The test for extrinsic study is to ask how well the reconstructed context suggested by the interpreter fits the available evidence inside and outside the Bible. And finally, we will discuss the methods of studying the contemporary worlds of the Bible. We will touch briefly on several approaches developed in recent decades that strongly emphasize the role of the contemporary reader in interpreting texts. We will also distinguish various uses to which contemporary readers put biblical texts. So we'll begin with intrinsic study, journeying into the literary world. And here's our introduction. Methods of study that focus on the intrinsic worlds of biblical texts share the assumption that any text creates a world of its own. Adapting the principles of the 20th century school of literary analysis known as formal or new criticism, some biblical scholars have sought to describe those literary qualities that make each text unique. Our assumption is that the place to begin and intrinsic study is with recognition of formal literary features such as genre, theme, and structure. We have identified 6 steps appropriate to an initial examination of the literary world of a biblical text. So number 1, establishing the boundaries. An interpreter of the Bible describing its literary worlds can present a variety of readings simply by narrowing or widening what is in view. While it is legitimate to study the entire Bible, one section, one book, one collection of literary units within the book, one single literary unit, or one passage within the unit, more limited boundaries will enable a more specific and detailed description. In other words, the smaller the unit, the more detailed you can go. In reading an intrinsic study of a biblical text, be aware of the limits of the world being described. In this work, our primary attention will be on books of the Bible and the major collections of literary units within them. However, we will sometimes change the perspective and look for characteristics of sections of the Bible, and sometimes even venture comments on the Bible as a whole. All right. Next we turn to distinguishing the type of literature. Intrinsic study also describes the types of literature present in the world being analyzed. As a framework for this step, we will outline some of the forms of literature found in the Tanakh and New Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, we encounter many different types of literature, among them myths, legends, historical narratives, short stories, sermons, genealogies, chronicles, songs, meditations, oracles, blessings and curses, and codes of law, prophetic sayings, proverbial sayings, poetic dialogue, and apocalyptic visions. Although today we use the term myth to speak of stories that are assumed to be false, we must set that definition aside if we are to understand the myths in the Bible and in other ancient literature. So just because we say something is a myth does not mean it is not true or that it did not happen. In general, myths are stories about actions of divine beings. So stories about God. Actually, many modern interpreters of religious literature use the concept of myth in a more general sense to refer to any narrative that establishes the worldviews for people, whether or not divine beings are involved. So from this perspective, myths are foundational stories that establish basic values, goals, meanings, and acceptable modes of living. And then obviously in that sense, the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is full of myths. Now, the common definition of a legend is an account regarded as historical, but not verifiable. So legends focus on human characters, not God quite as much. God may be involved, but the focus is a human character. Formally, legends focus on a single event or series of events and on a single character, pair of characters, or family. Sometimes legends are combined into cycles to tell a connected story. Historical narratives are developed accounts of events and people of the past. The historical narratives of the Bible deal with events and people in the development of the nation of Israel or early Christianity. In the Bible, historical narratives always relate to the past in order to highlight an underlying meaning, usually in terms of the divine purpose. The short stories of the Bible are distinguished from legends, and that they are narratives in which a sustained plot is developed through a series of closely connected scenes. Although they may relate to questions of history, they move behind the scenes to a more individual story. A sermon is an address by an individual that speaks of God and the divine involvement with and purposes for people. Sermons usually exhort people to action and challenge people to be obedient to God. Genealogies are lists of names purporting to record the pedigree of an individual or the relationship among families, clans, tribes, or nations. Chronicles give accounts of past events and persons. Unlike historical narratives, chronicles simply list, using a formula, the events and persons with no attempt to highlight underlying causes or meanings. The types of literature described so far tend toward prose. The rest that we will discuss are more poetic. Songs are poetic compositions that give indication of having been put to music or performed. Meditations are long poems that do not seem to have been sung, but rather seem to reflect on various themes. Oracles are utterances or pronouncements from an authoritative source about what is going to happen in the near or distant future, introduced by a formula. Blessings and their opposite, curses, are also pronouncements with the formulaic introduction, blessed be or cursed be. They announce well-being or disaster for persons or groups. Blessings and curses are rooted in the belief that once uttered, they carry effective power that cannot be revoked because they invoke the power of the divine or God's power. In the New Testament, we find many of the same types of literature as in the Tanakh. Again, the Tanakh is what we call the Old Testament. If you don't remember that from last week, we say that in respect for the Jewish people that obviously don't think there is a New Testament, or they don't have an Old and New in their scriptures. Their whole scriptures are the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. Hopefully you remember that from last week. So if you see Tanakh, just think Old Testament, because that's the more common term used. So however, the New Testament also introduces new types of literature. There is no precedent in the Tanakh for the two most dominant literary forms of the New Testament, gospel and letter. Within the Gospels and letters of the New Testament, there are several other types of literature not encountered to any significant extent in the Tanakh. Many of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels are in the form of parables, brief narratives that forcefully illustrate a point. Another common rabbinic literary form, the Midrash, is found in a number of New Testament books. The Midrash cites or alludes to an authoritative text and applies it to a new situation. In the letters, Paul also adapts lists of virtues and vices similar to those found in Greek ethical treatises. Okay, observing the language, in addition to distinguishing the type of literature, an intrinsic study requires sensitivity to the language, to the nature of the language of the biblical text. Because the Bible was written in languages quite different from modern English, students dependent on translations need to make a special effort to become familiar with the characteristics of biblical languages or biblical language that can be observed in translation. The basic distinction to be made is between poetic and prose styles, though the style of biblical language defies such neat categorization. We should think of the distinction as 2 points on the same continuum. Some texts have language that tends toward the poetic side. Others have a style that tends toward prose. All right, let's see if this can be corrected. Let me try to close this. Okay. Okay, poetry can be distinguished from prose by the regularity of its style. Prose language tends to have sentences of irregular length and rhythm. In general, poetic language observes conventions that give it uniformity of line length and rhythm. The principal convention of biblical poetry has come to be known as parallelism, which might better be called balancing, seconding, or extending. Biblical poetry is almost always composed of two-line or three-line units in which the elements of the second and third lines balance the elements of the first by reasserting, strengthening, or in some way completing them. Biblical poetry is composed then of thought units, words or phrases that are structured in 2 or 3 lines of roughly equal length. Rather than rhyming, the lines are related through balancing of thought units. Sometimes the thought units of the first line are balanced by their repletion or repetition in the same order in the second line. In other couplets, the second line contrasts the thought of the first. Another type of balancing is stairlight. One part of the line is balanced in the second, but the thought is developed further. It is not enough merely to categorize the type of parallelism in a biblical poem. It is important to ask how the balancing contributes to the world being created. The larger sections of biblical poems consisting of groups of 2 or 3 unit lines are often called stanzas or strophes. There is no set length for the stanza of biblical poems, although they are usually short. Sometimes a refrain marks the end of a strophe. On occasion, there is an acrostic, meaning an alphabetic arrangement of strophes in which each stanza begins with a subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet. A good example is Psalm 119. As we shall see, there is often a parallelism among the stanzas of a poem, with one balancing another. Now, in one sense, biblical poems are like musical compositions. Rather than linear arrangement, there is a concentric ordering in which themes emerge, slip away, and then come together again. Open this again. Because biblical poetry draws on the stock of images of ancient Israel and the ancient Near East, some of the poems need clarification. For example, pit is a metaphor for Sheol as the dwelling place of the dead. Water imagery is often a way of speaking of the chaos that opposes the divine ordering of life and therefore threatens humanity. The use of graphic imagery, including metaphor and simile, is as typical of ancient Near Eastern poetry as it is of English poetry. Unfortunately, many of the poetic devices of biblical poetry are lost in translation, such as word plays and repetitions of sounds, such as alliteration and assonance. Other devices, such as irony, can be noticed in translation. Biblical poetry was meant to be spoken and heard. Even in translation, its impact can be felt, especially when read aloud. The other type of language to be observed in the Bible is prose. This is used principally in historical narratives and stories. It is also found in legends, myths, sermons, gospels, and letters. We can generally discern in prose a movement of thought from one point to another, more so than in poetry. By modern standards, biblical prose is very simple and straightforward. In describing or narrating scenes, biblical stories get right to the point. There is a minimum of background information and asides typical of modern stories. The plot is developed through straightforward descriptions of actions, or frequently through reported dialogue of characters. The pace is quick. Given the abruptness and brevity of biblical prose and its refusal to look into the thoughts and feelings of characters, readers must infer motives and intentions. For example, instead of telling us about the divine plan to create the nation Israel, the narrative simply begins with the Lord speaking to Abraham. From this utterance, we infer the divine intention. Another characteristic of biblical narrative prose is foreshadowing. Often the outcome of a story is indicated at the beginning, as when Rebecca learns that her younger son Jacob will displace his older brother Esau. The action then revolves around how everything falls into place to bring this about. An important characteristic of biblical prose and poetry is repetition. Keywords, phrases, and scenes recur, giving an indication of something to which the poem or story wants to draw our attention. Repetition also serves to build tension or add a nuance by balancing two elements. Having made the distinction between poetry and prose and described some of the major characteristics of each, we should reiterate the point with which we began, that this distinction should not be pushed too far. Much prose has a poetic quality in the Bible, and much poetry has the character of prose. Nevertheless, asking whether a text is more poetic or more prose-like can be helpful in trying to understand its world. And number 4, searching for themes. In an intrinsic study of a text, an interpreter should look for the theme or themes. A theme is an organizing motif that dominates a literary unit. A theme is an interpreter's words for what is seen to be dominant. For example, in asking the theme of the Pentateuch, one study suggests that it is the partial fulfillment, which implies the partial non-fulfillment of the promise to or blessing of the patriarchs, the ancestors of Israel. The themes of particular books can also be perceived. For example, the theme of the Song of Songs has been stated as the paradox of love in the world. In an introductory study, the identification of themes can be a very helpful way for readers to enter the literary world of the Bible. Related to themes but distinct are motifs, images that recur in texts but do not constitute the theme. Observing the principal motifs in a text is often important. For example, the recurrent motif of putting on and taking off clothes in the story of Joseph in Genesis. Identifying the structures. Number 5, the language of texts forms patterns that can be observed, which then become maps to the literary worlds. We have already considered structure in the phenomenon of parallelism, or balancing, by which poetic language is patterned. In alluding to types of literature, we have also begun to speak of structures, for each literary form has a typical structure. We should discriminate between typical structures, patterns shared by literature of a certain type, and unique structures, the individual patterns of separate texts. We should also discriminate between the formal or surface structures of texts and deep structures, the implicit structures in the text that manifest culturally determined or universal patterns of life and thought. And number 6, presenting an integrated reading. The final step in an intrinsic study is offering a reading of the text being interpreted, drawing together observations gathered from these steps just discussed, as well as others. The point of intrinsic study is not merely to analyze texts, but also to offer synthetic readings of them. Rather than merely running through the steps of intrinsic study, we will present constructed readings that draw on the various insights of this type of research. All right. I'm not sure my notes are going to show up. I'm having a lot of technical problems with my computer, so I will try to email those hopefully You can receive them by email if you want to follow along. I realize you may not be able to see them, and I'm not sure I can get this to work again for this period. Let me just close the notes since they're not showing up very well. Okay, we'll move to extrinsic study. Entering the historical world, there are two types of extrinsic study of the Bible. One that focuses on the historical development of the literature itself, and another that uses the Bible as a historical source in an effort to reconstruct the history of the biblical period. A variety of specific methods of analysis have been developed for the first area. The methods that attempt to reconstruct the stages in the development of biblical texts can be identified as literary history. To reconstruct the history of the biblical period, we will use the empirical method of historiography, which means the study of historical writing, drawing especially on the discipline of archaeology. Now we turn to literary history. Two methods of extrinsic study aim at uncovering the earliest stage in the composition of the Bible. Tradition criticism seeks to reconstruct the development of individual elements or traditions within texts to find their point of origin and to trace how they have been adapted as they have been transmitted. The central concern is the pre-literary stage in which traditions circulated orally. A second method used in studying the early stages of the literary history of the Bible is known as form criticism. Form critics look for clues to the context in which the text most likely functioned at the time of its writing, and even earlier at an oral stage. New Testament form critics have studied the Gospels to determine the situations in the life of the early Christian community in which particular types of literature may have developed. For example, pronouncement stories in which Jesus makes a pronouncement on a topic which may reflect a controversy in the later Christian community. Form criticism is most effective when there is clear confirmation of the relationship between a form and its life situation, as in the book of Joel, between the lament form and a ritual fast. Source or documentary criticism is a type of analysis that seeks to identify the various written sources used in the writing of the Bible as part of the effort to reconstruct the history of the literature. The first result of this type of study was the so-called documentary hypothesis, which claims that behind the Pentateuch in its final form were a series of written sources or a cycle of oral tradition combined. The literary historical method known as redaction criticism addresses the final stage in which the text is edited. Redaction critics look for evidence of the work of an editor who has combined sources together to create a text or added material to an existing text. Perhaps the best example of the value of redaction criticism is its application to the final stages in the composition of two of the New Testament Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Redaction critics have learned much about the perspectives and contexts of these two Gospels by comparing and contrasting how their authors drew differently on the principal sources used. Redaction critics also pay close attention to the introductions, conclusions, and scenes between sections of a text for which they often reveal the perspective of the text's editor. Redaction criticism has also been applied to the Tanakh, as source critics have determined that the editors of the Chronicles most likely used the books of Samuel and Kings, or perhaps the sources on which they were based. Redaction criticism is most valuable in cases in which there is comparative evidence to demonstrate that sources have been edited. Textual criticism examines the transmission of works once they have been written and seeks to reconstruct the most likely original texts. Canonical criticism examines the works in terms of their place in the collections deemed authoritative in the Jewish and Christian communities. The historical process did not end when books were written, but continued as they were selected and ordered canonically, not merely as literature, but as scripture. Okay, we'll turn now to the Bible as a source for history. And we'll start with the empirical historical method. Fundamental to all scientific inquiry is the concept of control, the introduction of a standard that permits ideas and evidence to be evaluated in an orderly manner. The most fundamental question that historians seek to ask and answer is, what actually happened? Historians ordinarily apply a form of the empirical method by developing a hypothesis, what may have been the case, and then they examine the available evidence, the documents, and the archaeological data, or they may do that in the reverse order also. Historical anthropology, one method of the empirical method increasingly used in the historical study of the Bible, is the use of models borrowed from the social sciences, particularly sociology, social psychology, and anthropology. We shall use anthropological insights or models in addressing issues in biblical history. The method we are using might also be called historical anthropology. Historical revisionism. Historians and other scholars who present views that differ greatly from commonly accepted positions are sometimes called revisionists. They perform a valuable service to their disciplines by preventing smugness and obliging persons with more traditional views to re-examine the basis of their conclusions. The most vigorous revisionism movement in biblical studies today may be a group of scholars, often called minimalists, who argue that the historical books of the Tanakh were edited so late that they could contain no valid historical information about earlier periods. Professional archaeologists have been critics of minimalist theories, and recent archaeological discoveries have undermined the minimalist position, such as a stone wall in the city of David, showing evidence of strong government during the age of the United Monarchy. Biblical archaeology. The area of scholarship known as archaeology is a form of historical inquiry. It may be defined as the study of human cultures through the investigation of their material remains. Biblical archaeology is a branch of historical archaeology concerned with the study of the biblical world. Archaeology has revolutionized biblical studies over the past century and a half by revealing the cultures of Israel's predecessors and neighbors. The recovery of the literature of other ancient Middle Eastern cultures has enhanced understanding of the Bible. Archaeology in biblical lands concentrated for many years on the sites of cities with their monumental architectural features. More recent investigation of smaller sites and the study of ancient life in its total ecological context has led to a much fuller understanding of how people lived. Excavation of occupation sites is the most typical activity of archaeologists. This digging is done carefully and systematically according to a controlled plan. The greatest care is always essential since sites can only be dug up once and must be done right the first time. Archaeologists also conduct larger scale surveys to study settlement and land use patterns. Archaeological findings must be carefully recorded and artifacts carefully labeled if they are to have scientific value. Finally, the results must be reported in scholarly journals and books so that the results can be used and interpreted by other scholars. New archaeological discoveries or new interpretations of older finds, some with profound implications for our understanding of biblical history, are announced almost every year. For example, an excavation in 2010 revealed inscriptions that may be the first evidence of the creation of the alphabet, a writing system with fewer than 30 signs and straightforward rules associating signs with consonant sounds. If this theory is correct, all three of the languages of the Bible, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, were among the heirs of a system of writing developed by Canaanite workers engaged in dangerous work in a desolate area who were invoking divine blessing and protection. Another theory based on interpretation of archaeological finds relates to a proposition that in ancient Israel, a distinction existed between elite priestly religion and popular or folk religions. Elite religion dominated the class that wrote the Tanakh and took a mostly monotheistic perspective, condemning worship of any god other than the Israelite deity Yahweh. Folk religion is manifest in a variety of archaeological finds, leading to the theory that most Israelites worshipped a number of gods, including a goddess that they saw as the consort of Yahweh, often called Asherah. So thus, in the folk religion of ancient Israel, God had a wife. And I need to point out that this kind of folk religion was actually denounced in the Tanakh or condemned, that there were times that the Israelites engaged in idolatry like the worship of Asherah, but they were always condemned by the prophets for doing so. So just because this happened does not mean it was a correct thing to do. So the fact that archaeological finds are sometimes valuable has created an international industry consisting of undercover diggers, smugglers, and shady antiquities dealers, in addition to a network of legitimate dealers around the world. The value of artifacts has also led to the creation of fake artifacts. The most spectacular alleged forgery in recent biblical archaeology is the James Ossuary, a box found in 2002 claiming to bear the bones of James, the son of Joseph and brother of Jesus. The implied biblical connection of the James Ossuary created an immediate international sensation, and it was soon claimed that it provided the first physical link to the family of Jesus. After carefully examining the ossuary, the Israel Antiquities Authority concluded that the inscription was a modern hoax, meaning it was fake, not real, though other scholars challenged the findings. In 2005, 5 men were charged with forging the James Ossuary and trying to pass it off as the actual burial box of the brother of Jesus. Archaeologists and other scholars have testified both defending and challenging the ossuary's authenticity. Let's try opening the notes one more time. This will be the last time I try. I don't think they're going to work, unfortunately. let's talk about uses of the text. Traveling into the contemporary world, several specific methods have been developed recently, stressing the role readers play in determining the meaning of texts. They illustrate the attention now being given to redefining our understanding of the contemporary world of the Bible. Reader response or reception criticism argues that the meaning of a text is not a given residing in the text itself or in its historical context, but in the unique interaction between a particular reader or group of readers in a particular situation with the text. One controversial modern interpretation is known as deconstruction or post-structuralism, emphasizing the ambiguity in both texts and the interpretation of texts. Deconstructive critics argue that readers actually create their own texts in their encounters with literature. So thus, the idea of fixed texts and authoritative literature with set meanings must be deconstructed, replaced by awareness that all texts have an excess of meaning that continually emerges as they are encountered by particular readers. Deconstructive readers also assert that texts are not limited to written works, but include anything that that signifies virtually anyone or anything can be a text. Now, some deconstructive critics speak of intertextuality. It's a complex word that means for each reader, any text is actually a constantly changing web of many texts, including the reader's own experience. Readers create their sense of meaning in relation to this network of texts. Kind of a very radical approach. I don't, some of these things, these ideas, I don't totally agree with, but just wanted to point them all out to you. Now, by liberation criticism, we mean approaches to interpreting the meaning of the Bible from the context of one or more oppressed groups in the world today. All forms of liberation criticism affirm that the Bible takes the side of those who are victims of oppression and calls for their liberation. Another emerging group of methods for studying biblical texts is called feminist criticism. All forms of feminist criticism share the conviction that the Bible itself and virtually all interpretations of the Bible have historically reflected the ideology of male dominance or patriarchy. So one feminist scholar has identified 5 contemporary perspectives among those who emphasize the patriarchal context in which the Bible was written. First is the rejectionist. This view says the Bible must be rejected as a source of authority for contemporary society because of its unrelentingly negative attitude toward and portrayal of women. 2 is the loyalist view. It says that since the Bible is the word of God, it cannot by nature be oppressive, since God is not oppressive. When the Bible is used to support the submission of women today, the fault is with the interpreter, not with the text, or not with the Bible, but those that interpret the Bible. The revisionist approach says a positive perspective toward women is evident not only in general themes, but also in particular biblical texts. However, the crucial role of women, which is often evident in the Bible, has been obscured by the ancient patriarch at the time of the Bible's writing, or the ancient patriarchy at the time the Bible's writing, and by the male-centered attitude of interpreters throughout history. The sublimationist says that there is In biblical symbolism, a glorification of the feminine found in imagery for God, Christ, and also people of faith, such as Israel as the bride of God or the Christian church as the bride of Christ. And the liberationist view says that the biblical proclamation of God's liberation of the oppressed peoples includes freeing women from patriarchal dominance. Another important dimension of the reading of the Bible in the contemporary world is the question of the various uses of the Bible. Religious texts such as the Bible have typically been put to at least two types of uses: theological and devotional. The theological use is based on authoritative religious teaching from the text, as when theologians derive the doctrine that the world was created out of nothing from the biblical accounts of creation, or the doctrine of the Trinity from the New Testament language about the relationship between God the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. The devotional use may be either communal or individual, but its purpose is personal and experiential rather than intellectual. Persons are led to some sort of religious experience or insight through devotional study. The Bible is also frequently used in the development of ethical teachings. Some religious texts are also suited to liturgical use. They're used in worship. Lessons from the Bible are read in Jewish and Christian services. Psalms and other sections of Scripture may be sung, chanted, or read. Another use of the Bible may be called political. Whenever interpreters appeal to Scripture to support a particular action by, for, or against governing authority, they are using the Bible politically. For example, people have used the Bible to support action aimed at ending legalized abortion, as well as government action to assist the hungry and homeless. All these uses of the Bible that attempt to derive a contemporary meaning from texts have their proper places, but can be misused when their appropriate places of application are confused. While we will not engage deliberately in such uses of the Bible in this class, we recognize that contemporary questions are important and of great interest. And thus, I will present questions for further reflection and discussion at the end of each lesson. There are also case studies in the book. I'm not sure we'll be able to cover those in class, but they're always worth reading if you get a chance to read the textbook. So we have now surveyed the three worlds of the Bible and the methods appropriate to studying them. We have distinguished the literary, historical, and contemporary worlds and charted a course for entering them. We can now begin the journey into the Bible itself. So I'll close the notes because I don't think they're going to work again this evening. That's really a shame. I'm sorry about that. And I hope that you can get the notes by email so that you can read along with this lecture. Just having these technical problems with my computer that are interfering with the notes being visible. Okay, so now we turn to chapter 3 in our book, Origins. And we get into the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is an account of the creation of the universe. We see that in chapters 1 and 2. Next, the origin of human communities, we see in chapters 3 through 11. And then finally, the beginnings of the people set apart by God in chapters 12 through 50, or to the end of the book. The focus gradually narrows from the entire cosmos to one couple, Abraham and Sarah, and then begins to widen again with their descendants. In this chapter, we will examine the literary and historical worlds of each of these sections before raising questions related to the contemporary world of Genesis. We'll start first with the prehistory, the cosmic origins in Genesis 1 and 2. And the literary world, we'll look at the balance in Genesis 1 through 2. The theme of the first 2 chapters of Genesis is the creation of the heavens and the earth by the one God. A sub-theme is humankind's special place in this creation. However, there is not one creation account, but 2 that are different in both content and style. The first account is patterned as 6 days of creation, followed by a 7th on which the creator rests. Then there is a transitional statement that sums up the first account and introduces the second. In the second account, creation is described again with the focus on the origins of humanity and other living creatures. There are significant differences in the content of the 2 creation stories. In Genesis 1, the order of creation is light, heaven, earth, vegetation, sun, moon, stars, sea creatures, birds, land animals, and humanity. In Genesis 2, the stage is entirely the earth. And the creation of humanity precedes the creation of vegetation and animal life. In the first account, the creator is identified simply as God. That's the Hebrew word Elohim, and is present through the commands that cause the creative acts to occur. In the second account, the creator is called Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, adding the proper name of the deity to the general designation and portraying him as intimately involved in the happenings in a hands-on manner, forming man from clods of earth like a potter, and later taking a rib from man to form woman as a suitable helper for him. The 2 accounts also differ stylistically. The first is precisely choreographed with the days numbered like the scenes of a drama. Each act of creation results in a pair of opposites. The 6 days of creation are likewise balanced into a pair of 3-day sets. In the first set, a context is established for creation. In the second set, the actors appear, climaxing with the lead character on the earthly stage, that is humankind. Before creation, there was a formless chaos. After creation, there is an orderly cosmos. Further, God has placed within it his human agents, formed in his own creative image and charged to enhance the level of order. At this point, the creator rests, sanctifying the Sabbath day of rest for both humans and domestic animals as a humane institution. The second account has a narrower focus and a much different story, not just a description. Everything takes place more or less at once. There is no ordering, balance, or careful symmetry, as in the first account. Man is created, and then the creator goes about developing a place for him, along with food and companions. There is spontaneity in this account, as though the creator is pursuing an experimental process. In the first account, there is no real tension. Everything is balanced and harmonious. In the second account, tensions are quickly established. The man is commanded not to eat of one of the trees. He is also alone and in need of companionship. The second tension is resolved with the creation of woman, but the first tension is left unresolved. To the modern reader, the 2 creation accounts cause a dilemma. If there are 2, which is correct? However, this perspective imposes a foreign standard on biblical literature. Two of the basic techniques of both biblical poetry and prose are repetition and balancing. To offer and set aside, or to set side by side two different accounts is to emphasize the importance of cosmic origins and give a broader perspective. The two accounts together give a balanced view of the Creator. To respect the literary world of Genesis 1 through 2 is to recognize how the two separate accounts complement and balance each other. Let's turn now to the historical world, creation accounts of the ancient Near East, literary history. The different creation accounts in the first two chapters of Genesis provide evidence for literary historians that the editor who produced the final version of Genesis used at least two sources. The most widely accepted theory about the multiple sources that were combined in the editing of Genesis and other books in the Pentateuch is called the documentary hypothesis. Proponents of this theory maintain that there are several sources evident in the Pentateuch. The most commonly held version of the documentary hypothesis is that there are four sources in the Pentateuch, three of which are evident in Genesis. These sources are known by the first letters of the names assigned to them by scholars: J, E, P, and D. The source usually assumed to have been the first one written is called J, which stands for Yahwist, because the divine name Yahweh is spelled with a J in German, and that was labeled this way by the German biblical scholars who first stated this theory. So the source has the name Yahweh that appears in it. There's a very personal anthropomorphic description of Yahweh in the J narrative. J emphasizes the role of women, such as Eve and the wives of the patriarchs. The narrative clearly focuses on Judah, the tribe to which King David belonged. Many scholars believe J was written by a member of the royal court of David or Solomon. The minority view of the minimalist school is that J was a late work written after the Babylonian invasion of Judah and the destruction of the Davidic monarchy, and added as part of a post-exilic preface to the Book of Deuteronomy. According to most supporters of the documentary hypothesis, the next source written is called E, the Elohist, because it favors the divine name Elohim. It is usually assumed that E was composed in the northern kingdom of Israel about a century or so after J. In the E source, the deity often communicates through dreams and is more indirectly involved in human affairs than the J source. Because the evidence of E is fragmentary in comparison to the three other hypothetical sources, some scholars have argued that rather than being a full narrative, it is better understood as a collection of oral traditions instead of a written source. The hypothetical D, which stands for Deuteronomist source, likely refers to the bulk of the material found in the present book of Deuteronomy. According to most scholars, D was probably written during the time of King Hezekiah or Josiah of the southern kingdom, so about the 8th through the 7th century BCE. Some in the minimalist school take the position that D is actually the oldest of the sources of the Tanakh and is evident in some passages in the first four books of the Pentateuch. And the last of the four sources is called P, which stands for the priestly writer, because of its interest in matters of worship and law associated with the priesthood. P also prefers the divine name Elohim. Like E, but its style is more formal than J and E, and its view of the deity is more majestic. The first creation account is assumed to have come from the P source. Most proponents of the documentary hypothesis speculate that the P source was written in the post-exilic period, perhaps in the 5th century BCE. Now, according to this theory, an editor or redactor, often designated by the letter R, combined these sources to form the final narrative. While the documentary hypothesis remains the dominant theory about the literary history of the Pentateuch, many scholars have challenged its sometimes arbitrary divisions of the literature and the circularity of its arguments. And many people today just say that we don't really know who wrote the Pentateuch or how it came together. Literary historians increasingly speak of strands of oral tradition rather than written sources as the components combined in the final version. Many ancient peoples developed creation accounts rather than substitutes for science. These were statements about the meaning of the cosmos and the status of things in it, while often justifying some political or social order. The stories told by Israel's predecessors and contemporary neighbors presupposed polytheism or belief in many gods, and often situated creation in a dispute or struggle among the gods. For example, in the Babylonian story or myth, Enuma Elish, the cosmos was formed when the patron god, the Babylonian god patron, Marduk, killed Tiamat. Tiamat was the threatening dragon of watery chaos and divided her corpse to form the dome of heaven and dry land. The status of humanity in these narratives is often problematic. In some stories, humans were created to be the slaves of the gods, providing offerings so the gods, along with the ruling class and priests, would not have to work. The Israelites used the combat creation theme as a poetic metaphor, but not in their creation narratives. Their creation accounts do, however, share common motifs with other nations in the ancient Near East. While similarities can be noted, the Hebrew accounts are monotheistic. The one God creates a stable material universe requiring no ritual supports. Humanity also holds a high status, and humane institutions are created. The Israelite stories thus reinforce the world-affirming optimism and humanitarianism characteristic of the Torah traditions. All right, we'll continue with the prehistory and talk about communal origins and Genesis 3 through 11, and the literary world of separation and Genesis 3 through 11. And we'll start with the Garden of Eden story, Genesis 2, chapter 2 through 3. As a result of divine creation, there is harmony between the creator and the principal creation, humankind, between humanity and nature, and between male and female. The one remaining source of tension is the prohibition of eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. That tension is exploited in the next scene, which can be considered part of the Garden of Eden story. The harmony of creation is broken by the rebellion of humankind, and the result is alienation and separation. The serpent plays the role of trickster, exploiting the human desire to be like God. This desire proves to be too strong to resist, so the woman and man eat the forbidden fruit, thinking that it will make them become like God. The result is the replacement of harmony with separation. There is estrangement between the man and woman. They begin to blame each other. And next, there is or at least the man blames the woman. Next, there is separation from the Lord. They hide from God. Finally, the harmony between humankind and the earth is disrupted as the ground is cursed and the man and woman are expelled from the garden. And humankind is aware of the basic source of alienation and human life, namely death. Despite the swift reaction of the Lord to this act of disobedience and the pervasive sense of alienation, a new tension is introduced that balances the negative tone. There is a glimmer of persistent harmony between man and woman, and the Lord still has compassion for humanity. Now, the influential Christian theologian St. Augustine saw the sin of Adam as a prototype, something that set in motion the action of human sin, which was inherited by all subsequent humans. Original sin, or we call that the theological term, the fall, for the term for the event. But other interpreters have described it merely as an archetype, illustrating the typical bad behavior of people behaving rebelliously against God, but not seeing this as causing the later rebellion of humans, or giving humans original sin, making it inevitable that they'll sin against God or corrupt human nature. Our next story is Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, 1 through 16. The next story is the account of two brothers, Cain, a farmer, and Abel, a herdsman. It too is a story of alienation due to the Lord's unexplained preference for Abel's offering over Cain's. The real problem is Cain's inability to master sin. Cain murders Abel and afterward experiences alienation from nature, from other people, and from the Lord. Yet the Lord protects Cain with a mark to warn whoever might try to do violence to him that Cain belongs to the Creator. Now we turn to the flood, which takes place in Genesis 6 through 9. The next extended narrative, the flood story, follows the same pattern seen in the earlier stories. The sons of God, which are usually seen as divine beings, like angelic beings, are the culprits, indicating that rebellion has spread to the divine realm. They have intercourse with the daughters of men, which leads to God's observation that humankind is completely evil. Creation has been so disrupted by rebellion that a new start is necessary. The blameless Noah will be spared, along with representatives of the animal kingdom. You may know the story of how Noah builds the ark and takes animals aboard the ark, so his family is saved and his animals are saved, while the rest of the earth floods. So in a graphic return to pre-creation chaos, the chaotic waters flood the earth and the stage is set for a new beginning. Next, we have the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. In the final story of the prehistory, or in the prehistory, the Tower of Babel, there is again an act of rebellion, building a tower to the heavens in an attempt to facilitate human access to and control of the heavenly realm. The result is alienation, as the human languages are confused. The story also humorously mocks human arrogance, as the grand project is so trivial that Yahweh must go down to see what is going on. So they aim to reach the heavens, but they're so far away that God has to come down to be able to see what they're doing. Now, the theme of Genesis 1 through 11, considering Genesis 1 through 11 as one literary unit, the prehistory, we can observe a general theme. It is the tension between the harmony present in the created order and the alienation that occurs as a result of the human refusal to accept the prescribed limits of creation. Let's consider also the prehistorical world, setting the stage for history. The prehistory sets the stage for history and tries to render comprehensible the Israelite understanding of nature and history through the traditions in Genesis 1 through 11, or though the traditions in Genesis 1 through 11 may have roots in historical objects and events. One of the dramatic news bulletins generated by early Mesopotamian archaeology was the discovery of silt deposits at various locations, clearly the work of great floods, which were quickly associated with Noah's flood. There are other examples of Mesopotamian flood stories, the best known of which is the Gilgamesh epic. The biblical flood story almost certainly traces back to Mesopotamian origins. The Noah story is grounded in history in the sense that its authors were reworking an ancient folk tradition that itself rested on actual human experience of a great flood. So something like the flood seems to actually have happened. Whether or not it is exactly the same as the Bible describes, it may be very close. And I think there is good reason to think that the story of Noah is basically a true story. In some ways, it is more feasible or more credible than the other flood stories. And you see that the dimensions of the boat it describes would be more likely to actually float on the waters and not sink, or they'd be more likely to survive in that boat. Now, marine biologists have presented findings about the Neolithic catastrophe that formed the Black Sea, arguing that runoff from melting glaciers 15,000 years ago raised the level of the Mediterranean Sea to the point that its waters invaded the Bosporus Valley and cascaded into the former freshwater lake beyond, leading to rising water levels that inundated farms, villages, and ports. The authors speculate that accounts of this disaster spread to Mesopotamia and became the basis of the ancient Near Eastern flood stories, while oceanographers and deep sea explorers seek discoveries of ancient shipwrecks and drowned villages. Most folklorists and archaeologists believe the early Mesopotamian archaeologists were right. The flood stories, as they come down to us, were inspired by successive floods in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley that rose but then abated so that normal life could resume. However, in the final analysis, given the current state of evidence, we simply cannot talk about history when discussing Genesis 1 through 11. There is not enough specific concrete evidence to ground these events in any historical context. Thus, not all materials that ground in history are necessarily historical. These stories do not seem to function in a historical fashion to convey information about people and their experiences in space and time. Rather, these stories in Genesis 1 through 11 seem to be trying to answer basic questions about why things are as they are, explaining the origins of things. So in a sense, you can call them myths or legends. Now, that does not mean they did not happen, just that we don't have enough historical evidence to support calling them exact history. And they do function more to explain the origins of things than to tell historical details or narratives. So ancient creation origin stories also affirm the rightness of institutions and states of affairs in the world. The Babylonian Enuma Elish story grounds the Babylonian Empire, the Marduk cult, or that Babylonian religion, and the lowly status of the majority of humans in the actions of gods at creation. A high status for the totality of humanity is established only in the Israelites' narratives. The egalitarian aspects of the Torah are grounded in creation. So in that sense, we see the Israelite stories in the Old Testament definitely being superior, and the way of life that they prescribe. So that's something in their favor, or something that gives them greater value, I would say, than the other ancient Near Eastern mythology. Now, there has been a great deal of literary historical study of the sources used in the composition of Genesis 1 through 11, and this section is usually regarded as a composite of at least two literary strands, J and P, that we talked about, seen in the alternation of the divine names Yahweh and Elohim. Differences in literary style and interest, and differences and repetitions in the story. There seem also to be two versions of how many animals Noah brought onto the ark he was instructed to build. P says a pair of each species, while J mentions 7 pairs of clean and a single pair of unclean animals, perhaps assuming the clean animals would be slaughtered and eaten. In describing the cause of the flood, J speaks of 40 days and 40 nights, while the version in P is that the waters peaked after 150 days. While J describes the flood as the result of rain, P appeals to the imagery of creation in Genesis 1, with the opening of the windows in the dome created to hold back the chaotic pre-creation waters. After the flood, J describes Noah building an altar to Yahweh, on which some of the clean animals are sacrificed. In personal imagery, Yahweh smells the pleasing odor of the sacrifice and promises never again to curse the ground because of human evil. The version in P is of a restoration of creation with a repetition of the original command for humans to be fruitful and fill the earth. That is what God gave to humans at the time of creation. In Genesis chapter 1. So again, that's just the theory, the documentary hypothesis. That is not certain. That is how these stories came together, and not everyone agrees with that idea, but that is a dominant theory in biblical studies. So that is what we are considering today. And I think we'll stop here for today. Again, I apologize for the technical problems, and I will try to give those notes to you by email. Hopefully you get the notes along with this lecture. Otherwise, you can email me and I will send you a copy of the notes. I do want you to be able to read along with the notes along with the lecture and have access to those. So I have given you a primary text that is Genesis chapter 3. I do want to give you a primary text most days of class. We didn't get far enough last week, but we did get far enough. I'll go ahead and give you Genesis 3 as your primary text, which tells the second part of the story of the Garden of Eden and humans rebelling against God and falling into sin by eating the forbidden fruit. Now, your usual homework assignment, which is necessary for you to get attendance credit, is always the same. Number 1, did you watch the lecture video? Number 2, what is a main idea that you took from this week's lecture? And then for extra credit, I give you 2 questions. 1, do you think it's important to have a clearly defined method when you study the Bible? Why or why not? At this stage of your study, which of the methods described in chapter 2 do you find most intriguing and most confusing? Give reasons for your answer. And then read the primary text I gave you, Genesis 3, for the second question. Reflect on and discuss each of the characters. Do you find in the portrayal of the characters insights into human nature? What does the story teach about the relationship between God and humans? All right, now, as far as length goes, I would suggest maybe maybe a paragraph to half a page to answer the main assignment, and then no more than a full page if you answer the other two questions, another paragraph each, or maybe between 1 to 2 pages altogether if you do the extra credit. I don't expect you to spend too long on this. I had one student complain from my other class that she spent 10 hours, and I'm very surprised. I didn't think that the questions I asked were nearly enough to spend 10 hours. I know this is new material, but she's, I believe, more of an overachiever, and I'm sure she did the extra credit as well. But if the extra credit is too much for you, then just focus on the main assignment. I just want to give you the best chance to get the most possible points if you want to do the extra credit. But if not, then just the main assignment will be sufficient for your attendance credits. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, but send your assignment to me by email in the next week or so. Hope you all have a great week and take care.